As we talked about in the last video, we were talking about the First Continental Congress. We talked about the Battle of Lexington and Concord, how the British were pushed back, and that was a huge morale lifter for the colonists. And then the colonists met together again, the leadership in the Second Continental Congress in 1775. The first one was in 1774. And Lexington and Concord happened between these two congresses. And there were a lot of people in the Congress who said, you know, we need to fight, we need to stand up. But there were a lot of people in the colonies who, they sure thought what the king was doing sucked, but they were not at all to the place where they wanted to revolt. And there were a lot of colonists that stayed loyal to the king for numerous reasons. One thing that was just unheard of, they've never known not being British in terms of being under a monarchy and a king and parliament. The other thing is many of them had political ties, business ties with England, and they knew that power, that status, it could impact their business. So they were not, they're like, oh, yeah, the idea of independence may be okay, but not if it's going to impact my personal checkbook. So there were lots of different reasons for the loyalists to stay loyal. It wasn't just one or two things. But the colonists who wanted to stay as a part of England, they were called loyalists, they were loyal. And the colonists who wanted to break away from England were called patriots. Now, other colonists who supported people who wanted to break from England called them patriots. Loyalists would call them rebels, would call them traitors, would call them saboteurs. So these are the names that the patriots kind of gave each other, that they were fighting for this great cause, the cause of their rights and their liberties. So that's what, even within the colonies, you would have neighbors who were against neighbors, neighbors spying on other neighbors, and it began to be extremely disruptive in these communities. From this map, what would you predict? Look at the key, and look at, remember, a loyalist is somebody who wanted to support the king. Patriot is somebody who wanted to declare independence. And then you had Native Americans here who are neutral, not on either side. And then some strongly contested areas. And what we mean by contested is these are areas where there wasn't a majority of people for or against. It was kind of equal. And they did not have a strong population going one way or the other. But why, when you look at the colors, where do you predict what areas would be most in favor of the war? So you take a moment and just write that down and bring that to class tomorrow. The colonists take sides. Again, if you were a patriot, most colonists were patriots. A lot of the local governments were controlled by the patriots. The loyalists, they were in every colony, but again, they were merchants and landowners. This is really key. African Americans many times were loyalists. And the British promised the African American slaves, if you would come fight for us, we will give you freedom. So the African American slaves, not necessarily the freed African Americans, were very pro-British. And Native Americans, very much. There were some tribes, especially close to the colonies, that were very, we'll go with the king, and the king will promise there's no more land taken. There were some early battles. We talked about, here is Massachusetts, we talked about Lexington, we talked about Concord. And then there were some early battles up in this northern part Some of it is southern modern day Canada, and some of it is the northern states up here. And the Patriots at the very beginning of the war had a lot of success. And it was like the British just didn't quite get a handle on how to fight or what was going on here. There is a fort up here, Ticonderoga, that the British used as an outpost, and especially developed when they fought the French and Indian War to push the French out of here. And once the French were gone, they occupied that fort. It was the way to really control between the Hudson River Valley and Canada. Okay? So, they had lots of weapons there, and the Patriots overran it, captured all the weapons, and they marched these weapons through the snow. And you need to, these cannons are 3-4 tons through the snow, just using oxen down here to Boston. So what does that tell you about the Patriots? What does that tell you about this army? You need to answer that question and bring it back. This speaks volumes to some of the reasons why they began to win these beginning battles. When they brought those cannons back to Boston, in Boston, Boston has a huge harbor, and the harbor is surrounded by hills. So you will have your water here, and then these are hills around the harbor of Boston, and as this part comes up here. And they surround it. Well, the Patriots went to occupy Boston. Remember, Boston was, there was an embargo against Boston. It was surrounded. It was closed off by the British Navy ships. The ships couldn't get in and out to trade with Boston. And so Boston was a key city. The Patriots were on top of this one hill called Bunker Hill. And as the British began to storm the hill over and over again, one group, then another, they just took them out because they had the strategic position. So that for a few days they won, and they kept pushing back the British Army until the British Army had surrounded this hill and they ran out of ammunition. And they succumbed to the British advance. But again, it was the idea that they could hold off this massive army for a few days. And so you have great victories, but you also have a lot of people just living normal lives. Remember, there wasn't the internet, there wasn't electricity. So this stuff is happening up in Boston. This stuff is Ticonderoga's in today Upper New York. This is happening at Lexington and Concord. If you are in one of these southern colonies, it's happening up here. If you're in a southern colony, it may be 4, 5, 6 days before you hear of anything going on. And if you live in the backwoods part of the colony, it could be 2, 3 weeks before you hear anything. And so even though the people fighting, the people in those areas were very engaged, very part of it, many of the people in the rest of the colonies who were not understanding or experiencing the effects of all this firsthand, kind of like not really sure how they felt. And one of the things that really pushed people to declare one side or the other was a booklet, a pamphlet, written by Thomas Paine. And the name of it was called Common Sense. And Thomas Paine, in a very legalesque manner, just begins to put out main point after main point after main point after main point why we are forced to declare our independence. As this pamphlet was printed and spread throughout the colonies, people really began to change their mind. People really began to get on board. And the people who didn't want to rebel, there began to be a greater division within the people in the colonies. And here again is a picture of Thomas Paine. This is what the front of the pamphlet looked like. He had 4 main points, 4 subjects, which he elaborated on within the pamphlet. 1776. Okay, we're into 1776, and Henry Lee introduces a resolution. We're fighting, we're getting an army, we really are at war with the king. And Henry Lee is like, okay, listen, if we're at war, it's kind of like being at a battle within your own home. You'll see, let's say, a man and a woman who are married, they're fighting and fighting and fighting. All of a sudden they declare, we need to separate, or we need to divorce. We need to not be connected legally in any kind of way. And Henry Lee was somebody who attended the Continental Congress. And he stood up and he said, I'd like to propose a resolution. And have the Congress vote on it, that we would, in a sense, divorce Great Britain, declare our independence, that these colonies are, and of right, ought to be free and independent states. That was voted on in the Continental Congress, it was passed, and Thomas Jefferson was chosen to write out the reasons. The same way in a marriage, in a family, they can separate, they can get divorced, but you have to have a legal document that tells the court what are the reasons for the divorce, how are things going to be divided. It is the same thing here. Jefferson needed to produce a document that explains the reason for the divorce. He wrote it, it went through a lot of revisions, he brought it to the Second Continental Congress. People read it, there were hot debates, we don't like this word, we don't like this line, over and over and over again, until finally they condensed it. One of the main things that was an issue was some slavery issues here as early as this part in our nation. It was voted, finally, a final draft, the draft we know of as today, was voted on, it was accepted, and it was declared, set forth on what we call our national birthday, July 4th, 1776. Once the document was written, once it was declared, read, once it was sent to the king, once it was kind of declared throughout Europe, that is our birthday. Like with a divorce, once the judge says, okay, boom, you are now two separate entities. In that moment, they're two separate entities. That's when we became a separate nation. Declaration, Jefferson wrote, it has 3 sections. It has the preamble, the list of the natural rights God has given us, the list of issues or grievances that the colonies had against the king, and because of these issues, that we had the right to dissolve our bands or dissolve our connection with England. And we will look at what happens after that in the next video.